Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. Today is a treat. We're joined by Aimee Ansari. Aimee, you're very welcome to VistaTalks. First time on the show, and we're delighted you're here. Thanks for being on the show, Aimee.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
Well, that's great. And for people watching or listening, I know within the language and localization industries, you're pretty well known at this stage. But for maybe some of our other listeners around the world, you're the Chief Executive Officer at Clear Global, Executive Director with Translators Without Borders. Let's start with the basics. Can you cover the two organizations, how they came about? Give us a bit of the backstory, Aimee.
Okay, well, Translators Without Borders is the original organization founded by Lori Thicke following the Haiti earthquake. Lori had founded Translators Without Borders in France. Lori and Roz Thomas Smith had founded Traducteurs Sans Frontières, and they were doing translations, mostly medical translations, pro bono. And when the Haiti earthquake happened, they were being asked to do translations into French. And Lori said, but you do know they speak Haitian Creole, right? Um, and that's when Lori sort of realized that the process that a lot of companies and businesses had gone through about localization, the humanitarian and aid world had not yet. So she founded Translators Without Borders in the US. Um, I started about 9.5, 10 years ago as the first executive director. And I very quickly realized that that when I walked into a room and I said that I worked for Translators Without Borders, people would hand me a document and say, okay, can you translate this? And anyone in the industry knows there are a lot of other questions that you want to ask. There's a lot of research that goes on behind that. At that point, we were already starting to do research into what languages are spoken where, how people like to communicate. We were also building some small bits of language technology and glossaries and doing language maps and that sort of thing. And so we wanted to have broader conversations with people. And we found that the name Translators Without Borders was hindering that, and therefore not making the aid that we were providing as useful as possible and as effective as possible. So Translators Without Borders exists still. It's a thriving community of over 100,000 language enthusiasts. And also we are Clear Global. And that's really where the other parts, the research and the advocacy and some of the language technology development sits. Does that make sense?
It's great, Aimee. Thanks very much for giving us a little bit of insight into the two organizations, Clear Global and Translators Without Borders. Now, obviously, you mentioned there already that, from those sort of early beginnings to where it is today, over 100,000 language volunteers, which is phenomenal, and also contributed over 90 million words, probably a lot more at this stage. And lots of partner organizations around the world, right? And then, of course, how Clear Global helps you then extend that message and get into other areas that are as important. And you mentioned language maps earlier. I know you also recently released a new multinational sort of glossary, multilingual glossary, and maybe we'll talk about MPOX response as well. But maybe let's start with language maps. Give us a little bit of inside track there, would you?
Well, the language maps were really interesting. We had done some assessments in Northeast Nigeria around when Boko Haram was very active. They're still active, but not as active as they were before. A lot of people had been displaced from one part of Northeast Nigeria to another part of Northeast Nigeria. Where they were displaced to, the main language is Hausa. It's the lingua franca in that area. And so all of the information going out from the aid world, all of the information going out from the government, all of the aid workers themselves spoke Hausa. What they hadn't realized is that the people who had been displaced spoke Kanuri predominantly. And so the information that was going out from the aid world was really only reaching about 37% of the people who were affected by the conflict. And so we started asking around, well, what languages are spoken, and we found that there were no real maps with geopolitical boundaries. So you could find maps with little blobs on them, but you couldn't tell quite where those little blobs were. And so we started to develop them. So we did assessments, and we got into a needs assessment that the humanitarian world does. We got language questions into those, and then we developed some really interesting language maps and found out that there were about 13 languages that were spoken by almost all of the people, that covered almost all of the people in that context. And since then, we've developed about 30, 50, something like that, language maps. It kind of depends on how you count. So we'll develop a language map either through an assessment process, where there's a big, in a humanitarian response, there's a big assessment process, and we get language questions into there. And then we get that data out. And with that, we sometimes overlay literacy rates. So humanitarians and development actors know whether or not they should be communicating in text, or if radio or some other, or microphones or speaker phones are more appropriate. Sometimes overlay that again with mobile connectivity or penetration rates. And then also look at things like, do people use WhatsApp or Telegram? What radio stations are broadcasting in that area, in which languages? And television penetration, or print media, if there is some.
No,
So
it's
that's our map.
fascinating, Aimee. Thank you for sharing that. And you talk about media as well, and there are different types of media depending on where you are in the world. Some of it can be quite controlled, some of it can be extremely biased, some of it can not exist at all, depending on where you are. And I know Clear Global, on your site, you talk about how 4 billion people and climbing speak a marginalized language, and often can get left behind of those in those important global conversations, and particularly at a time when you're talking about humanitarian crisis and work like that. In terms of the work that you do, what means the most to you, Aimee? What's really driving you to get up every day and really make a difference in this environment? Because the work that you do, and I'm not just saying it, it's incredible.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. I've been an aid worker for almost 30 years. Don't count, don't, I know. And one of the things that, throughout my career, since the first place I worked was in southern Kyrgyzstan, and I was working with Tajik, Kyrgyz, and Uzbek communities. And I was hired because I spoke Russian, which made no sense. When I got there, I was supposed to be working with women's groups to improve economic empowerment and economic literacy. And I quickly learned that if I really wanted to understand the hopes and desires of these women, I really needed to speak Kyrgyz, Uzbek, or Tajik. And so I was always working with interpreters and translators and things right from the very first. And this followed me throughout my aid career. It was all the time, every place I went, we'd be playing this game of telephone where I would say, how many times did you visit the clinic this week? And the answer would come back, after going through 4 different languages, something like 4 goats. It was. And so when I found out about Translators Without Borders, I thought, oh my gosh, this is almost the silver bullet. This is, if we can scale language technology, and if we can make sure that there is the ability to take one language and put it in another language, then that means suddenly, people who have no voice and no power, and people are always throwing information at them, they can suddenly speak, and be heard. And instead of me saying, you need water, they can say, I can get water, but what I really need, a really pivotal thing in my career was I was in southern Sudan, and we were doing an assessment. The organization I was working for was doing an assessment, and it was an organization that basically worked in water and sanitation. So all we were going to do is water or latrines, you know. And we kept asking people what they wanted, and they kept saying burial cloths. And there's not an aid organization that provides burial cloths. But we couldn't really understand them, you know, and it was just this pivotal moment where you just sort of think, what am I doing here? You know, if I can't really understand what these people really need and then provide it, then I'm not doing my job. And so I think the work that we do at Translators Without Borders and Clear Global is really, really critical to ensuring that aid operations are effective. And even bigger than that, you know, we talk about 4 billion conversations, and CSA research actually just came out and said it's more like 3.7 billion. Well, it's another 300 million between friends, right? But we talk about starting these 4 billion conversations because the things that affect the planet so much right now. Think about climate change or the global crises that are happening. It's half the world's population who cannot talk about how it's affecting them, and what, even more importantly, what some of the solutions are from their perspective. And that's, I think, really a shame, and none of our efforts will succeed unless we can talk to half the population.
It's critical. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, your passion comes through, and the commitment that you and the organization provide to helping people and to empowering people through language, I think is a testament to the great work that you do. So thank you, Aimee.
Yeah, it's helping people to have agency that gets
Yeah,
me up in the morning,
yeah,
you know?
yeah, I can see. Yeah. Let me move the conversation on a little bit if I can, because we're talking a lot here about language and empowering people and giving people agency, but technology plays more and more of a role in that now. And I know you have Clear Tech.
Hmm.
So, from a technology perspective, can you give us a little bit of insight into that from Clear Global's perspective, and maybe unpack maybe some of these innovative technologies that help people engage in a better way?
Yeah, thanks. So when I first started in the organization, we were translating the 100 most accessed health sites on Wikipedia into 120 languages. So in Wikipedia, health sites that were most accessed, we were translating them into 120 languages. There were only 4,000 volunteers at the time, so they worked really hard and made it happen. But as soon as it took us years to do it, and as soon as we finished, the source content changed in some of them. And it sort of made me realize that while this got hundreds of thousands of hits, like these health sites got hundreds of thousands of hits because there was just no information in some of those languages. This was it. It also made me realize that we could just spend our whole lives doing this, you know, and it wasn't a very scalable proposition. So that's really when we started to think about, okay, how can language technology be useful to help scale some of these efforts and making sure that critical information is in the right language. So one of the first things we started to do was build the glossaries you mentioned earlier. The glossaries were it's a web app, so you can use it offline if you need to, and a lot of people do. And what they do is sort of standardize the way you render a term in a different language. And that sounds like, oh, it's just translation. These are kind of complicated terms sometimes. So it's words like prostitute. Now, how do you render that in another language in a way that is respectful? And also people understand what it means. They know what you're talking about. Or, you know, any sort of sensitive word like that. That's a lot of what those glossaries do. They also are recorded. So they'll have voice capability in them, and sometimes with sign as well. So the
No,
glossaries are an amazing tool. I've lost count how many languages we have glossaries in and how many domains.
a
Uh,
lot. Yeah,
a
a lot.
lot. Yeah, no,
Um,
yeah.
and it's like you're saying, though, you can't, it's hard to scale, isn't it? Because the technology has to play a role there as well in terms of scaling and in
Mm,
terms of reach. And as you're
mhm,
saying, at the early days when you had maybe less volunteers than you do today,
mm,
you can see the immediate impact. There's this thirst, this requirement for the knowledge. People need
mm.
the information, but they're struggling to connect. You know, it just it's not there. So it's only through the great work that you do, and of course, being able to pioneer some of this technology that you can actually reach more and more people, right, and scale.
Yeah, and so one of the things we found in Northeast Nigeria and in Bangladesh and in a number of other contexts was that um, even if languages are written, because people don't go to school and learn those languages, they struggle to read and write in those languages. So while we were building some machine translation, what we found pretty quickly was that the machine translation is necessary, but the speech recognition was just as critical,
Yeah, of
and text
course.
to speech also just as critical because it's hard if you're not educated in a language, it's hard to read or write it. So a lot of our focus now is on ASR, on text to speech and speech to text.
No, it makes sense completely, and thank goodness we're seeing improvements every week. You know, it is moving on tremendously. So hopefully we're
Mm.
able to help and reach more people. And you mentioned the glosses. That's great because I did want to come back to that as well because
Mm.
I know that's particularly good. But you also mentioned the some of the response work that you do in like MPOX, for example. Maybe let's talk about that for a moment if we can, Aimee. What's
Uh,
happening here?
well, we're not doing a whole lot, honestly, right now on MPEX because nobody really knows what needs to be done. But we've put out some guidance notes and have supported some organizations to do translations into relevant languages, particularly in Eastern DRC, Rwanda, that area. So Lingala, Nande, those kinds of languages. And the language maps, of course. They're always useful. We get more hits on the language maps than we do some months more hits on the language maps than we do on the careers page even.
And with that, I can understand that. Of course, that makes sense. I wanted to ask you though, if I can. I mean, we're bombarded with news. You know, if you're fortunate to live in let's say, a developed environment, you're receiving regular news updates. Um, the amount of crisis that seems to be going on in different pockets of the world, it seems relentless. Now, maybe, you know, maybe we get the news faster. You know, we're in a huge fast cycle now, so it feels overwhelming to a lot of people. But in terms of your own challenges as an organization, what do you think are some of the things that you are aiming to improve on or to focus more on? Or where are you moving to really from a future looking, forward looking? Because
Mhm.
there's always something that needs your attention, right? So how are you coping in that environment?
Um, so in a couple of different ways. One is, as I said, we're focusing a lot more on speech. So we're building a voice data collection platform right now called TWB Voice, where we can our community of linguists can record words, sentences, phrases, whatever, into this platform, and it is high enough quality and consistent enough that we can then use it to build the speech technology. We have worked with a number of other organizations with a number of other platforms and have found that while the data is good, it's not consistent enough or consistent quality enough to be able to reliably build ASR with it. So using all that plus the data we build, we then can build more voice data and then more models that are useful. And what we're really trying to do is start collecting that data now because it will be needed in the next crisis, in the next, whatever happens next. So we built a Levantine Arabic speech recognition system, for example, a couple of years ago for the World Food Program. And we're not using it right now because it's still quite early days. But we're talking to some of the aid agencies on the ground right now in Lebanon, for example, on how they can use that. Their hotlines and call centers are getting tens of thousands of calls right now. And, when that happens, it's hard to think about how to integrate a model into there, but we'll get there with them. Yeah, so that's really what we're looking for, is how do we put in place the infrastructure and the tools and the data we need now, so that when a crisis happens or when a model is needed, it's already there and we can turn it out pretty quickly.
No, thank you. That makes sense completely. And it's interesting because those sort of resources, maybe if I can use that term, that you're building, and the infrastructure that goes around that, obviously that takes time, effort, and money. So from an inner workings perspective, we don't need to go into numbers specifically, but in terms of actually getting the show on the road and growing and being able to provide all these services, obviously you work with partners, obviously you need people to volunteer.
Yes.
How does that work in the Clear Global and Translators Without Borders work today? Like what's important for you in that sense?
The most important thing, besides the community, of course, the most important thing is the sponsors. The sponsors give us money, and because we have that money, we can do things like build the infrastructure and support the community. And a community of 100,000 people is an interestingly resource-intensive thing to manage. You have to have people to manage that size of a community. And they're all wonderful, of course, but they have questions and, need help and all of that. So our sponsors not only give money often, they, like you are now, give us a voice and a chance to speak. They sometimes loan us technology that they have. There's all kinds of ways that our sponsors support the organization and the work that we do. Some of them provide project management, some of them provide linguists. It's an amazing, honestly, the localization industry is just incredibly supportive, and I feel so fortunate to have landed in this organization and with this incredible industry.
And if people want to volunteer or partner with you or offer support and help, is it just simply going to translatorswithoutborders.org? Is that the best place to send people to? And
if you want to volunteer as a linguist, then translatorswithoutborders.org is the best place. If you want to donate or become a sponsor or support in any other way, then it's clearglobal.org, or drop me an email. It's not, my email is not a secret in the industry.
Aimee's happy to talk, that's for sure. Yeah, happy to talk.
Always.
Yeah, very good.
And I'll be at Lock World in Monterey in a couple of weeks. So anybody who wants to meet me there, very happy to be there. Very happy to talk.
Yeah, it's great. Lockworld 52 Monterey, another great event to look forward to. And I think after that is back to Malmo, Lockworld 53, I think. So you can certainly catch up with Aimee and the team at a lot of these, I suppose, localization, industry, language type conferences too, right?
Yeah, and we usually go to Gala too.
Yeah,
So,
Gala, yeah, absolutely.
Any of those usually. And if not us, then there's always an Anne-Marie or a Donna, or somebody who knows enough about the organization to talk or to put you in touch with me.
That's great. Thank you. So in terms of what's keeping you up at night, what's on your roadmap as the CEO today? What are some of the things that you're thinking about at the moment in your world?
Money always keeps me up at night. Anytime you run a nonprofit organization, money keeps you up. And while we're very, very fortunate, we never have enough to do what we need to do. The other things that keep me up? I think as you mentioned, the sort of global crises, angst in a way, is affecting quite a lot of our team. And it's, in a way, it's really good to be working in an organization that helps people. It also makes you very aware of what's going on for those people. And so I worry quite a lot about our team and how they're coping. We have team members in 39 countries right now. And a couple of them have had to take leaves of absence because the places in which they work are in conflict. So I worry. I think, any good chief executive is always worried about their team, and
Thank you,
that's
Aimee.
one of my.
Yeah, and it makes the work as well. I mean, on one hand, I'm sure it's extremely rewarding when things go well and it helps, and on the other hand, I'm sure it can be extremely challenging, right? Because you're at the heart of some of, big tragedies, and it's difficult, and sometimes you need a little bit of respite away from that, so you can be even more effective, right?
Yeah.
Not easy, not easy.
Yeah.
So before we run out of time, Aimee, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you would like to include, or maybe some parting thoughts for our worldwide audience here before we bring this one to a close?
What I'd like to say is that we're building a movement for language inclusion, and we would like everybody to be a part of that movement and talk about it and advocate for language to be an integral part of what everybody is thinking about in terms of global and local conversations. Ask people what languages they speak and what languages they're comfortable in. Make sure that we're hearing those voices, and get involved. Just be involved. And if you can donate, great. And if you can't, you can run a fundraiser, or you can volunteer, or you can talk your company into supporting us, or put them in touch with us, and then we can talk them into it.
Well, that's great, Aimee, and that's a great point for us to call this episode to a close. I want to thank everybody who watches and listens to VistaTalks, and of course, thank Aimee, the Chief Executive of Clear Global, and of course, Translators Without Borders, and all the wonderful work that you do in there. We are truly indebted to you for the great work that you do there, and thank you to you and the team, because I know it's not easy work and it makes such a difference on a global scale. So thank you, Aimee.
Thank you. And thank you for making the space. And thanks to everybody in the industry for their support and help.
You're more than welcome. And look, I hope people can join me back here on another VistaTalks, where once again we'll be talking to some interesting people all around the world, just like Aimee. But thanks so much indeed, Aimee. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.